The train was half an hour out of London, and Harry Potter had eaten 4 chocolate frogs, 2 pumpkin pasties, and approximately half a bag of Bertie Bott's every flavour beans, and he was beginning to understand that this was what happiness felt like. He hadn't been entirely sure before. He knew what it felt like to be not hungry, which was different. Not hungry was what you achieved by eating just enough that your stomach stopped complaining. This was something else entirely. A stomach that had been given permission to be full, 2 hands full of food, and nobody taking it away. A red-haired boy named Ron, across from him, who was trying to explain Quidditch through a mouthful of cauldron cake. Harry found he didn't particularly care whether he understood the rules. The sound of being talked to was good in itself. "And that's the quaffle," Ron was saying, "which is what you're after most of the time, and it's worth 10 points when it goes through the hoops." The compartment door slid open. 2 people stood in it. One was a round-faced boy clutching a toad with both hands, looking relieved and slightly damp. The other was a girl. The girl had bushy brown hair and very brown eyes and a fixed, efficient expression that made Harry think of people who had prepared carefully for a trip and were now checking items off a list. She was wearing school robes that were already pressed. Harry couldn't have explained how he knew they were already pressed. He just did. She looked at Ron. She looked at the toad boy. She looked at Harry. He watched her notice his clothes. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a look, a single downward glance that took in his sleeve, hanging past his wrist because it was Dudley's sleeve, and Dudley had 3 inches of arm on Harry in every direction. She looked at the collar, sitting somewhere around his collarbone. She looked at the glasses, crooked on his nose because the tape at the bridge was never quite straight. "Have you seen a toad?" said the round-faced boy. "I've lost one." Ron hadn't. Harry hadn't either. The boy looked crestfallen. "I'll help you look," said the girl in a tone that did not particularly invite discussion. She looked at Harry again. "I'm Hermione Granger. That's Neville Longbottom." "Harry Potter," said Harry. "And this is Ron Weasley." Something shifted in her expression for half a second. The name landed in a way he was already starting to recognize. Then it passed and she looked at him with her previous expression, thoughtful and precise, and aimed directly at his collar. "Are those your own clothes?" she asked. Harry blinked. "What?" "Your clothes," she said. She was not being unkind. She was being exact. "Are they yours?" He understood then what she had noticed. He'd worn Dudley's old things for so long that he'd stopped thinking about whether they looked like anything from the outside. A very large person's clothes on a small person's body. "They're my cousins," he said. She nodded, very slightly. "They don't fit," she said. "No," Harry agreed. Ron had gone quiet. Harry could feel it without looking. "Why didn't your family get you things that fit?" she asked. Not unkindly, just directly. "For school, I mean. There's a whole list." Harry opened his mouth. He didn't know what to say, so he said something true, which was that the Dursleys hadn't particularly wanted to spend money on him. He said it quickly and moving past it, the way you step over a loose stone in a path. He was in the middle of explaining about the shopping trip, the small allowance, the instructions to make do, and he heard himself say, "I didn't have much space for storing things anyway. I was in the cupboard under the stairs." He hadn't meant to say that last part. A small silence opened up between them. Hermione Granger said, "The cupboard. Under the stairs," Harry said. He could feel his face doing something. "It wasn't... I've got a proper room now. They moved me in July." "They moved you," she said, slowly, tracking the logic of it step by step. "In July. How long had you been in the cupboard?" Since I was small. I don't really remember when it started." Another silence. This one had a different quality to it. She was looking at him with an expression he wasn't sure he'd seen directed at him before. It wasn't pity. Pity had a softness to it, a looking down quality. This was level, the expression of someone who had heard a thing and was working out what to do with it. "That's not right," she said. The most ordinary sentence in the world. She said it the way you'd say the sums had come out wrong. Not dramatic, just true. "It's fine," Harry said, because that was what he always said. "It's in the past now." "It's not fine," she said. "Children don't live in cupboards." "Hermione," said Neville quietly, as if he wasn't sure whether he should be saying her name or not. "He can hear me," she said. That's why I'm saying it to him directly and not behind his back." "I can hear you," Harry agreed. "Good. Then hear this. It's not fine, and you know it isn't, even if you've been telling yourself it is." She was 11 years old and the daughter of dentists, and she was looking at him the way people looked at a problem that had a solution somewhere. "Don't you?" Harry didn't say anything. Ron hadn't said anything in quite a while. Hermione looked at Harry for another moment and then she stopped. Not permanently. He could see that whatever this was for her was not finished, but she stopped for now. "We should go look for Neville's toad," she said. She put her hand on the door frame to go. "I'm going to think about this." "You don't have to," Harry said. She didn't answer that. The door slid shut. Harry and Ron sat in the small silence that followed. "She's a bit much," Ron said in a voice that was being careful. "Yeah," Harry said. He turned to look out the window. The countryside was going past, green and rolling and nothing like Privet Drive. He had been trying not to think too hard about the fact that he was going somewhere, that this was actually happening, and it was happening to him. "Ron," he said. "Yeah, never mind." He reached for a chocolate frog before it could escape the card. "The chasers, how many are there?" Draco Malfoy arrived 20 minutes later with 2 large boys who stayed in the corridor and a face like a blade, pale, pointed, grey eyes that assessed things quickly and found most of them wanting. He looked at Harry. He offered his hand and something else alongside it. The information that the right sort of people were going to know each other, and it would be better to establish the connection early. Harry looked at the hand. He thought, without meaning to, of Hermione Granger saying, "That's not right," just observing the error, just naming it. He thanked Malfoy and said he thought he could tell the wrong sort from the right sort himself, and Malfoy's face did something cold and he left. Ron stared. "Do you know who that was?" He introduced himself. "He's going to remember that." "Probably," Harry said. He ate another chocolate frog and went back to the window and tried not to spend the rest of the journey thinking about what Hermione Granger had said and whether or not she meant it and why the thought of someone meaning it made something sit strangely in his chest. She had said she was going to think about it. He believed her. That was the odd part. He completely believed her. The great hall was enormous and bright with hundreds of floating candles, loud with the noise of students who hadn't seen each other since June. Harry sat at the Gryffindor table after the sorting. The hat had been decided about that, and he ate. He ate with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who had learned not to trust abundance entirely. Roast potatoes and beef and thick gravy and bread and something with pears that tasted like the best thing he'd encountered in recent memory. He ate the way you eat when some part of you still expects the plate to be taken. He was aware that Ron was talking and that he was answering, but mostly he was concentrating. A few seats down, Hermione Granger was eating too. He looked up once and caught her watching him. Not staring, she was too precise for staring. Just watching, the way she'd looked at his sleeve on the train, measuring something. She looked away when his eyes met hers, back to her food, quickly and without embarrassment. Harry looked back at his plate. She had looked at him like a problem with a solution somewhere. He ate another potato and decided to think about it later. The candles burned bright above the 4 long tables. Somewhere in the castle, Professor Quirrell was beginning a dinner he could not finish because the back of his head was already occupied. Harry Potter ate until he was full for the second time in one day and did not know yet that the girl a few seats down had already opened a question she intended to answer. The library at Hogwarts smelled like old paper and candles and something else, something that was probably just being old and enormous and built when nobody had thought too much about ventilation. And Hermione Granger had claimed a table in the back corner by the last week of October and treated it as hers from then on. Nobody disputed this. There were several reasons, but the main one was that Hermione was already there when you arrived and still there when you left and made it quietly clear that she had arranged the table to her own organizational specifications and would prefer you didn't disturb them. She was doing 2 kinds of research simultaneously. One kind was visible, her charms notes spread in a careful formation, cross-referenced with her transfiguration reading, organized by subject in the way she'd organized everything since she was 7. The other kind was in a small composition notebook she'd bought at a W.H. Smith near King's Cross before term started, and which lived in a specific pocket of her bag where she could reach it without looking. She did not write in it at the library. She wrote in it in the dormitory, late, after Parvati had fallen asleep. She had written to her parents in October. Her parents were dentists in Oxfordshire, and they had, between them, a combined reference section that covered most of what you needed to know about being a professional adult in Britain. She had asked them, in a letter she'd worded very carefully, to send her anything they had on the law around children's housing and guardianship. What the law required, what the law prohibited, what recourse existed, when what was required and what was prohibited were happening at the same time. They had sent it through Muggle post to the address of a village post office near Hogsmeade, whose postmistress had been confused but amenable. Her father's covering note said, "Is everything all right?" Her mother's said, "The relevant sections are highlighted in yellow." She was 11 years old. She was building a case file. She was aware, in a peripheral way, that this was not a normal thing for an 11-year-old to be doing. She was not particularly deterred by that. Halloween came, and then the troll did. There is a standard version of what happened. The way the troll got into the castle because the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor had released it as a diversion. The way Hermione was in the first-floor girls' bathroom when it found her. The way Harry and Ron came in, after it, and between the three of them managed to knock it unconscious through a combination of wand work and the troll's own club, and a quantity of luck that none of them would fully appreciate until they were older. The standard version is accurate. It leaves out some things. It leaves out, for instance, that when Hermione came back to consciousness, she was in the hospital wing, and the troll had a headache that would probably last a week, and she had a bump on her forehead, and Ron had already gone back to the tower with Percy because Percy had feelings about visiting hours. Harry was still there. "I haven't forgotten about the cupboard," she said. He looked at the blanket on the bed. "I know you haven't. I just wanted you to know." She was still in a hospital robe that was slightly too large for her. The bump on her forehead made her look, for the first time since Harry had met her, like an 11-year-old who had had a difficult afternoon rather than a person of business. "That's all." He nodded. The wing was very quiet. They sat in it together for a while. In late November, she requested a private meeting with Professor McGonagall. She had prepared what she wanted to say. She said it in the order she'd arranged it in the notebook. The cupboard under the stairs from Harry's earliest memory until last July, when he'd been moved to Dudley's second bedroom, not out of any change of heart, but because the letter from Hogwarts had been addressed there, and the Dursleys had decided relocation was easier than explaining a cupboard to a magical school. She said the clothes Harry was wearing on the train were his cousin's, 4 inches too long in the sleeve. She said, "A child does not arrive at a school feast and eat with the focused, anxious attention of someone who has learned not to trust the food being there tomorrow unless something has taught him that." McGonagall did not say Hermione was wrong. She did not say she hadn't noticed. She sat very still in the way that people sit when they are holding something too heavy to put down and too heavy to keep carrying. Then she said that the placement was the headmaster's decision, and that it was not within her authority to overturn it. "Can you go to him?" Hermione said. "I have." A silence that had a specific shape to it, the silence of a door that was already shut, with some weight against it on the other side. "I objected, Miss Granger, before you were born." Hermione. "And he overruled you?" McGonagall. "Yes." Another silence. She told Hermione to come back if she learned anything new. She meant it. Hermione believed her. And this, Hermione understood, was the most McGonagall could offer, and it was being offered genuinely, and it was not enough. She wrote that night, in the dormitory. McGonagall said she already objected in 1981 and was overruled. The channel to Dumbledore is controlled by Dumbledore. The rest of the year operated on its own logic, as the year's specific danger tended to do. There was a trapdoor and a 3-headed dog and a sequence of challenges that had been designed by the full staff and felt like it. A giant chess set, a logic puzzle involving potions, devil's snare, a troll already knocked out by somebody else. Hermione spent most of May in the hospital wing for a separately relevant reason and was not present for the confrontation at the end of the corridor. She learned what had happened from Ron, and then somewhat less completely from Harry, and understood from the shape of his accounting that he was not telling her the worst of it because he thought the worst of it would upset her, and she was already in the hospital wing. She filed this. Harry protected people from difficult information as a reflex. He had been trained to minimize. When Harry was discharged, Dumbledore emerged from the ward before him, spoke a measured and affectionate good evening to no one in particular, and walked away down the corridor. Hermione was waiting in the hall outside. She had not managed to speak to the headmaster. She had discovered, in the previous 3 weeks of trying, that there were no appointments available through channels she had access to. No meetings outside of formal Hogwarts business. No routes to him that weren't routed through his own office at his own discretion. She watched his retreating back, the silver hair, the unhurried walk of someone who did not need to hurry because things would wait for him, and understood the shape of the architecture for the first time. You could reach Dumbledore if Dumbledore permitted it. Everyone else went where Dumbledore directed. She wrote that down too, when she was back in the dormitory with her notebook. The Hogwarts Express ran south in June, and the countryside moved past the windows in its summer configuration, green and flat and warm in a way that felt like a different season than the Scotland they were leaving. Harry sat across from Ron and Hermione in the compartment, looking out the window. He had burn marks still fading on his face from whatever Quirrell had done when he touched him, and the tired, settled look of someone who has been in a hospital bed for a week and has had time to get used to being alive. Hermione said, "I haven't found a way to fix this yet." He looked at her. "It's fine, Hermione," she said. "You don't quite believe that anymore." A pause that was longer than the usual kind. Ron was looking very carefully out the window in the direction of a passing field. Harry didn't say anything, which was not the same as saying it was fine. He turned back to the window, and the train kept going south, and Hermione looked at the back of his head and noted, in a part of her mind that kept records even when she didn't have the notebook in front of her, that this was the first time he had not said it. It was small. It was the right kind of small. The bars went up in July. Vernon had installed them himself, which was the kind of project he was good at, something with a clear, visible outcome, a thing you could step back from and say, "There, done, that's fixed." They were proper bars, not cosmetic, thick, flush with the frame, solid. He'd also cut a cat flap in the bottom of the bedroom door. Food went through the cat flap. Harry's owl went through neither, and they'd locked her in her cage as well, which was the crueler of the two arrangements, though both were cruel enough. Harry had his homework. He had Hedwig's company when she was calm, and his own company when she wasn't. He had a window with bars on it, and through the bars he had the sky. He found he spent a lot of time looking at it. The letters didn't come. He had expected Hermione to write. She was the kind of person who wrote, and the silence had its own quality, like a sound turned off. He told himself she was busy. He told himself, with less conviction as July went on, that this was fine. He did not know a house elf had been sitting in the kitchen since June, collecting every piece of post addressed to him. Hermione had been writing since the second week of July. Her letters were organized, not panicked, despite the impulse toward panic, asking clear questions with enough context that he could answer easily. She had numbered them and kept copies in the composition notebook. By August, she had 16 unanswered letters and the specific, pointed feeling that something was wrong. She wrote to Arthur Weasley. She had met him briefly at King's Cross, and he worked at the ministry, which seemed like the kind of thing that might be useful, asking if anyone in the family had been in contact with Harry recently. He wrote back saying they had not, and that they were looking into it. He did not mention that Ron and the twins had already decided to look into it themselves, in the Flying Ford Anglia, at 2 in the morning. Harry arrived at the Burrow at roughly 3 a.m. on a Tuesday in August, thinner than he'd left in June, with soot on his face and a trunk half-packed in the dark. He stood in the Weasleys' garden in the dark, in a night that smelled like grass and wood smoke, and felt the specific dizzy quality of air that had not been circulating through a barred window. Molly Weasley met them at the door. She said several things to her sons in a low, controlled voice. Then she looked at Harry, at the state of him, and said, "Come inside then," in a different voice entirely. She fed him. It was early morning and dark outside, and she fed him anyway and sat across the table while he ate. She asked pointed questions about the summer in a way that made them sound like ordinary conversation, and he answered obliquely, with emphasis on the parts that were fine. She noticed how he ate. She noticed how he startled, slightly, when she refilled his plate without asking, the way you startle when you are not accustomed to someone watching your food levels as a matter of care rather than rationing. She asked about the bars, and he confirmed they had been there and said it wasn't a big deal. She did not say anything about that, but she remembered it. She told Hermione what she had observed when the three of them met at Diagon Alley in late August. Hermione listened to Molly describe Harry eating with the quiet, practiced focus of someone who has learned to put food away efficiently while it is available. Then she said, There were bars on his window. He said it wasn't a big deal. He means he survived it, Hermione said. That's different from it being fine. She looked down at her hands. I need to write this down. She did write it down. And when term started, she went to McGonagall. She had brought the notebook. She did not open it, but she put it on the desk because she wanted McGonagall to see that there were pages of it. Then she described the bars. McGonagall went very still. Not the sitting with something heavy stillness of the previous November. This was tighter. She said, bars on the window. Installed in July, Hermione said. After Harry came home from school. This is not historical. The abuse, and I am going to use that word professor because I think it is the correct word, is current. McGonagall said, that is new information. I know. McGonagall went to Dumbledore, and Dumbledore asked to speak with Hermione. The office was circular and full of portraits of sleeping headmasters and a bird she suspected might be a phoenix. Dumbledore sat behind the desk and looked at her with the expression she was beginning to understand was his default with her, attentive, warm, and entirely directed at managing the conversation's outcome. He explained the blood protection charm. Not in full, she could tell the edges of the explanation by the places where he was careful with words, but enough, there was a magical protection bonded to Petunia Dursley's home, keyed to Harry's blood relationship with Petunia, and it was the most effective protection against Voldemort that currently existed. As long as Harry could call that house home, the charm held. As long as the charm held, Voldemort could not touch him. He said, "You're concerned as you credit, Miss Granger." She recognized this as a door being shut. She said, "The bars were installed in July. They are not historical. They are current year physical confinement, and it happened last month." She kept her voice even. She was 12 years old, and she was keeping her voice even in the office of the most powerful wizard in Britain. "I'm not asking you to remove the blood protection. I'm asking what will be done about the bars." He looked at her for a long moment. He did not dispute the evidence. He offered no revision to his arrangement. He told her, gently, that he would be in touch with the relevant parties and that she was welcome to continue coming to him if the situation changed materially. Hermione thanked him. She stood up. She walked out of the office and down the moving staircase and stood in the corridor for a long time with her back against the stone wall. She was not surprised. That was the worst part. That night she found Ron in the common room and told him the Dumbledore explanation. All of it. The blood protection charm, the strategic rationale, the fact that it was working as intended and would continue working because intended was the operative word. Ron put down his quill. He knows? The disbelief in his voice was specific. Not the disbelief of someone hearing new information, but the disbelief of someone finding the implications worse than expected. Dumbledore actually knows? He always knew, Hermione said. Ron didn't know what to do with that. He looked at the fire for a while. The rest of Year 2 was eventful in its own way. The Chamber of Secrets opened. Ginny Weasley was possessed by a fragment of Voldemort inside a diary. A basilisk was involved, and Harry came out the other side in June with a sword and a story he would not fully tell for several years. The relevant thing about Year 2, for the story Hermione was building, was that it consumed all available attention. There was always something else. There was always something enormous and immediate. She noted this in the notebook. The years were not quiet enough to allow sustained institutional focus on a single child's welfare. The emergencies kept arriving, and each one gave everyone an excuse. The train went south in June. Harry sat looking out the window, and Hermione said quietly, "The bars were real." He turned to look at her. "I know they were real," she said. "I just want you to know I know." Harry looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back out the window. He did not say it was fine. That was the second time he had not said it, and she wrote it down when she got home. She heard about the Marge incident from Ron, who had heard about it from Percy, who had heard it from his father, who worked at the ministry and knew things that filtered through in a particular careful way, stripped of details that might require explanation. The version Hermione received was this. Harry had spent 2 weeks of August hosting Vernon's sister, who had spent 2 weeks saying things about Harry's parents, specific, deliberate things, the kind designed to land. And one evening, Harry had lost control of his magic and inflated her, and she had floated to the ceiling like a balloon. He had then packed a bag and walked out of 4 Privet Drive and flagged down the night bus. The Ministry of Magic had covered the situation. She sat with this information for a while. The thing about it, the thing she kept returning to, in the way she returned to problems that had an angle she hadn't fully worked through yet, was not the balloon. The balloon was almost funny, in a specific, sad way. The thing was that Vernon's sister had been saying those things for 2 weeks. Presumably, she had been saying them on prior visits as well, and Harry had been absorbing it. He had been absorbing it in a house where he had no authority and no standing and no one who would defend him, sitting across from someone who was allowed to speak of his dead parents in whatever register she chose. Because the Dursleys' house was the Dursleys, and Harry was there on sufferance, and the sufferance extended to the dinner table. They had taken his right to grieve. She hadn't thought of it that way before, and now she couldn't stop. She wrote to Harry before term started. His response was brief and adjacent to cheerful in the way his letters were when he was trying not to make someone worry. He was fine. He was at the Leaky Cauldron. He'd had a good summer, all things considered. She read this 3 times and read it as, the weeks before the Leaky Cauldron were not something he was going to talk about in a letter. And then the other news reached her, and she forgot, briefly, about Vernon's sister entirely. Sirius Black had escaped from Azkaban. There were posters. That was how she knew first. Posters at Diagon Alley showing a gaunt man with matted black hair and hollowed eyes, a prison number printed beneath him, the name Sirius Black in large letters. She read the accompanying coverage carefully. Mass murderer. Betrayed the Potters to you-know-who. Killed 13 people in a single curse in broad daylight. Maximum security prisoner. Escaped. She read this carefully and absorbed it. And then she found the other fact, the one that was sitting underneath all of it like a stone at the bottom of a clear pool. Sirius Black was Harry's godfather. She found this in the same coverage, in a sidebar, mentioned as context. Harry Potter's godfather. Imprisoned since 1981. Escaped. She was on the Hogwarts Express when this fully landed. Harry was across the compartment. Ron was asleep. She looked at Harry for a long moment. His untidy black hair, his glasses, the thin face that was 13 now and still carried the habitual guardedness of someone who had learned early that the world was not reliably kind, and she thought, if Harry had a magical godfather, why was he placed with the Dursleys? Even accepting Sirius Black was guilty of everything they said. Even accepting the 13 people, the betrayal, all of it. Even then, Harry still had a magical godfather. Was there no one else? Had the wizarding world, in the wake of the war it had just won, genuinely not looked for anyone? Not checked whether the most famous child in Britain had other magical relatives, other connections, someone who might want him? Or had it simply been Dumbledore's arrangement, and Dumbledore's arrangement had not invited questions? She wrote this down in the notebook. She did not show it to Harry. The new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor was called Lupin. He arrived looking like he hadn't slept in several days. Wearing robes that had been mended so many times, the original fabric was mostly a structural suggestion, and he turned out to be the best teacher they'd had for the subject, which said something about the subject's previous occupants. He had known Harry's father. She identified this from small accumulated details, a particular quality of attention when he looked at Harry, a thing that happened in his expression sometimes when Harry said something particularly James Potterish, which apparently happened more than Harry knew. She approached him in October. She framed it as an academic question about wizarding guardianship law, which it partly was. She had genuinely been trying to find out how guardianship operated in the magical world and had found the library's resources on this remarkably thin, as though it was a subject nobody had thought to document because it had always worked itself out. She asked, if a magical child's parents died and their designated guardian was unable to fulfill that role, what was the legal mechanism for placing the child somewhere? Was there a process? Was there a record? Lupin looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who understood exactly what she was asking beneath the academic framing and had decided to respond to the academic framing. He said the process was largely informal, particularly in the years after the war, when there had been chaos, orphaned children, and a magical government partly occupied with not collapsing. He said he wasn't the best source for this. He said she might have more luck with historical ministry records, though he understood access to those was limited for students. He did not tell her her question was wrong. He did not tell her there had been a process and it had been properly followed. He deflected with the particular gentleness of someone who couldn't yet say what he knew. She noted this. She went back to the library. In November, during the Boggart lesson, Harry faced the cabinet. The Boggart that came out for Harry was a Dementor. She watched it from across the room and filed what she saw. Harry's face went blank first. The blankness before the Patronus, the split second of becoming something she didn't recognize, and then he raised his wand and the Patronus shot out, and the Dementor dissolved into silver vapor, and the lesson moved on. She thought about it afterward. His worst fear was not Voldemort. It was not the face of the man who had killed his parents. It was the thing that moved through the air and drained the warmth out of everything, that peeled hope away from a person the way you'd peel paint from a wall, that made every dark memory surface and every bright one fade. She had read about what it felt like to be near one. Victims reliving their worst experiences, unable to remember happiness, convinced that despair was the accurate and permanent state of things. She thought about 10 years in a cupboard. She thought about what you learned to feel in a house where warmth was conditional and food was measured and your existence was an inconvenience. She thought, he didn't develop that fear at Hogwarts. She wrote it down and went to Charms. By June, the year had produced its specific disaster and its specific miracle. Pettigrew's exposure, which meant the massacre in the street had been faked, which meant Sirius Black had spent 12 years in Azkaban for a crime he had not committed. She and Harry had used the time turner and gone back 3 hours and saved Sirius's life and saved Buckbeak the Hippogriff, and Sirius had flown away on Buckbeak into the night, and the Ministry had not exonerated him because the Ministry had not had time to find out he was innocent before he was already gone. He was still a fugitive. He was still wanted. He was innocent, and he was free, and he was wanted, and none of those 3 things resolved any of the others. She and Harry stood at the edge of the hospital wing in the early morning, after, in the particular silence of something that had just been almost otherwise. She said the thing she had been turning over all year. Sirius was innocent, she said. He was innocent when Dumbledore placed you with the Dursleys. He was in Azkaban because someone decided to put him there without a trial, without any process at all, and so the godfather who was supposed to have you never got the chance. She paused. And even before that, even before Azkaban, the wizarding world looked at the situation and put you with muggles who didn't want you, and it never asked, so far as I can tell from anything I've found, whether there was anyone who did. Harry looked at her. What question? That one, Hermione said. Why were you placed with people who didn't want you when there were people who did? The morning light was coming through the infirmary window. Harry looked at it for a long time without saying anything. She had expected him to say it was fine. He didn't. He said, I don't know. It was a small thing. It was the right kind of small. Arthur Weasley had visited many Muggle houses in his professional capacity, but this was his first visit to 4 Privet Drive in a social one, and it told him things he hadn't been prepared for. The house itself was not the problem. It was a perfectly ordinary Muggle house, meticulously maintained, with a garden that had been trimmed into submission and net curtains that were extremely clean. The problem was the way Harry moved through it. He came down the stairs carrying his trunk, which was already packed. Had been packed, Arthur suspected, for some days. And he moved through the hallway of the house where he had lived for 13 years, the way you moved through a place where you were temporarily allowed, not a place that was yours. He put his trunk by the door. He said goodbye to no one. He didn't look back. The fireplace situation had not gone as planned. The flue connection had worked from the burrow end. Arthur had come through fine, but the fireplace at number 4 had blocked the twins, and in the resulting confusion, Fred and George had accidentally left a bag of Tun-Tung toffees on the Dursleys' sitting room carpet, and Arthur had needed to use the Muggle door on the way out. He had said a polite good evening to the Dursleys, who stood in the hallway with identical expressions of someone who has recently eaten something they cannot identify. He had shaken Vernon Dursley's hand. He had been, he thought, quite personable. The drive from Little Whinging was long, and Harry sat in the back of the borrowed Muggle car and looked out the window, and Arthur asked the kind of careful questions he had learned to ask from a decade of talking to people who didn't know they could trust him. Harry answered in the particular oblique way Arthur had noticed before, at a slight angle from the thing being asked, slightly more cheerful than the situation warranted, slightly less specific. He was 14 years old. He had spent his summer packed and ready. Hermione arrived at the Burrow 3 days before the Quidditch World Cup by Muggle transport, with a bag that was organized in the way her things were always organized, and a look that was organized as well. She had been preparing to be useful, and she had prepared carefully. Molly fed everyone, because Molly fed everyone, and Harry was at the kitchen table eating, and Molly was moving around the kitchen doing 4 things simultaneously with the comfortable efficiency of someone for whom this was simply what kitchens were for. Hermione watched Molly watch Harry eat. It was not a long watch. Just a moment. Molly's hands pausing over a pot, her eyes going to Harry's plate, the brief calculation of whether it needed refilling, and the quality of attention behind it, which was different from the attention of someone keeping track of a guest. She was watching him the way you watched someone when you understood what the watching was for. Later, when Harry and Ron had gone out to the garden with the twins and there was a lull that felt like a gap in a fence, Hermione went to Molly. She said, "There's something I want to tell you about Harry. Not something that's happening now. Things that have been happening, I think you should know." Molly sat down at the kitchen table. She said, "All right." So Hermione told her. She told her all of it, not fragments, not hints, not the careful edited version she'd presented to McGonagall and the slightly fuller version she'd had to use with Dumbledore. Everything. The cupboard under the stairs from Harry's earliest memory until July 1991, which was 10 years, which was the majority of his life so far. The clothes, Dudley's cast-offs, grossly oversized, worn until they fell apart. The bars on the bedroom window that Vernon had installed in summer 1992 after Harry came home from his first year at school, and the cat flap that food had been delivered through. Vernon's sister visiting the summer before last and spending a fortnight saying things about Harry's dead parents at the dinner table. The way Harry ate when he wasn't on guard about it. The focused, unhurried efficiency of someone who had learned early that food was not a permanent condition. Molly did not interrupt. Her face changed as Hermione spoke, not all at once, but in increments, and Hermione could track each increment. The catalogue of the clothing, the years in the cupboard, the bars. By the time Hermione finished, Molly was holding very still. She said nothing for a moment. Then she stood up and pulled Hermione into a hug. Hermione went still in it. She had not expected this, had expected perhaps a question or a practical response or Molly's general-purpose brisk competence. And then she understood what the hug was. Molly was not comforting her. Molly was holding herself together. "Thank you for telling me," Molly said when she let go. Arthur heard the full account that evening from Molly in their bedroom, with the door shut. He listened with the specific quality of attention he brought to things that required him to think carefully before speaking, which was the attention of a man who spent his days in a ministry where words had consequences. He worked at the ministry, in the office that dealt with Muggle objects. He understood Muggle law. He also understood the statute of secrecy, which meant he understood, as soon as Molly finished, why every Muggle route that should have worked had failed. A Muggle Social Services investigation of 4 Privet Drive would trigger the statute before it could gather anything actionable. The cupboard was no longer Harry's room. The bars, presumably, could be removed. The evidence that remained was Harry himself, and children being thin and guarded and quiet in the presence of food was not, in a court of any kind, conclusive. He said he would think on what could be done institutionally. He said it truthfully, knowing that the answer, when he found it, was probably going to be not much. Dumbledore's authority and the statute of secrecy together constituted a wall that the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts Office was not structured to breach. Molly said, "In the meantime." He looked at her. He understood. In the meantime was not nothing. In the meantime was the kitchen table and the bedroom in the attic and the particular way their house worked, chaotic and full and always with enough food. He said, "Of course, he's family." Molly nodded. She turned off the lamp. The Triwizard Tournament year had a logic of its own, organized around tasks and spectacle, and the Hogwarts grounds doing unusual things at unusual hours. Hermione moved through it with the notebook in her bag and the case she was building somewhere in the background of everything else. She had been keeping notes since year 1, but during the long stretches between tasks, she began doing something different with them, retroactively organizing everything by date, by person, by type of evidence, and type of structural block. She wrote down what she had said and what each adult had responded. She wrote down why each route had failed, the statute, the blood protection argument, the absence of evidence that was still present. She wrote down Arthur's explanation of the legal architecture. She was building not just a moral record, but an institutional one. She did not know yet who would read it, but it needed to exist on paper, organized, specific, in case there was ever a moment when it could matter. By the time the third task came, it was 43 pages. Then Cedric Diggory died. She had not known Cedric Diggory well. He was several years older, a Hufflepuff, a Triwizard champion who had carried himself with the kind of dignity that came from having been quietly good at most things without requiring anyone to notice. He had died in a graveyard in June, killed on Voldemort's order, and Harry had brought his body back. The Ministry's response was to say this had not happened. The Minister himself had suggested that Harry was either mistaken or lying. The summer came, and Harry went to the Dursleys, and the world was, in several specific and material ways, worse than it had been in September. The train went south in late June. The compartment was quieter than the equivalent trip the year before, and the year before had been quiet. Hermione said, "The world just got worse, which means you need a better summer than the same summer, not the same summer." Harry looked at her. He was 14 years old, and he had watched a boy die and carried him back and had been told, formally by the people in charge, that this was not what had happened. He said, "I know." Not, "It's fine." Not, "Don't worry about it." Just, "I know." She looked at him for a moment. "I'll figure something out," she said. "I know that too," said Harry. She turned back to the window. It was the first time he had said, "I know," not as deflection, not as ending the conversation, but as acknowledgement, as something he meant. She wrote it in the notebook when she got home. First proactive acknowledgement, Year 4, June 1995. The letters Hermione sent that summer were her best work in the genre. She had been writing to Harry for 4 years and had learned, across those 4 years, the specific craft of it. How to say things that mattered without being alarming. How to ask about his welfare without making the question itself sound like an accusation of the Dursleys' behavior. How to leave space for him to say something real if he chose to. She numbered them. She sent them every 4 or 5 days. She kept copies. The letters she received back were not Harry's. That is to say, they were in Harry's handwriting. They were signed with his name, but they had a quality she hadn't encountered in his letters before. A careful vagueness, a cheerful imprecision, an absence of the specific details that his letters always contained. What he'd been thinking about, what he'd been reading, something Ron had said. These letters were about nothing in particular. They were fine. He was fine. Everything was fine. She had known Harry Potter since she was 11 years old, and she knew this was not how he wrote. She added a column to the notebook: dates sent, dates received, quality of response. By July, the column had a shape that told a story by itself. She wrote to Ron. Ron wrote back more fully than usual, which was to say he was clearly also alarmed but trying not to be. He had been getting similar letters. She wrote to Arthur Weasley, who worked at the Ministry and sometimes knew things. Arthur wrote back that there were people keeping an eye out and that Harry was all right, and the particular care in his phrasing told her the same thing Harry's letters had. Someone was managing this from above. It was August 2nd when Harry produced a Patronus in a Muggle alleyway. She knew this because the Ministry's improper use of Magic Office sent Harry an owl about it, and the owl found him at Grimmauld Place 3 days later, and he told her when he arrived, told her the whole account, quickly and in the flat factual register he used when something had recently been frightening. The alleyway ran between Magnolia Crescent and Wisteria Walk, in the part of Little Whinging she had never seen. 2 Dementors. Dudley had been with him. Harry had produced a stag Patronus, which he had managed before but not under those particular conditions, not on a street without warning, not when the alternative was a 15-year-old boy collapsing in an alley in Surrey. She listened to all of it. She asked about Dudley. She noted that Harry had been defending Dudley, along with himself, and thought that said something about Harry that she didn't yet have the vocabulary for. Then he got to the part about Arabella Figg, the old woman who lived on Wisteria Walk, who had been sitting for Harry for years, who Harry had visited when the Dursleys went out and didn't want to bring him, who had made her house intentionally unpleasant so he wouldn't enjoy it, had arrived immediately after the Dementors left. She had told him she worked for Dumbledore. She had known what a Dementor was. She had been there all along. Harry told Hermione this with the specific flat quality of someone who has processed a thing enough to relay it, but not enough to have finished being angry about it. He said, "She was watching from Wisteria Walk for years." A pause. "She deliberately made her house horrible so I wouldn't like visiting her. Dumbledore's instructions." Hermione said, "I know." And then, when Harry looked at her, "I didn't know it was her specifically. I knew there was someone." She had written it in the notebook 2 years ago. Dumbledore had eyes at Privet Drive and chose to watch rather than act. Now she had the address. She did not say, "I told you." This was not a moment for that. She found Sirius that evening. He was in the drawing room at 12 Grimmauld Place, which was a room that suited his mood, dark and over-furnished, with the stuffed elf heads on the wall and a general atmosphere of a house that had been unhappy for so long the unhappiness had become structural. He was 35 years old, and he had spent the summer inside this house, which was his house, which he had been trying to escape since he was 16. He looked like a man who had made a home in a particular kind of wrong. She asked him directly. She had found, across 4 years of escalating adults, that the indirect approach produced indirect responses, and she did not have the energy for it tonight. "Did you know," she said, "what it was like there, at the Dursleys?" He looked at her for a long moment with the eyes of someone who has been anticipating this question and has not worked out a good answer. He said, "Dumbledore didn't tell me the details." He said it carefully, not defensively, more like someone making an accurate statement that they are aware will sound defensive. "I was in Azkaban for 12 years. I came out in 1993 and I tried to reach Harry and then the Pettigrew situation, and then I was a fugitive. By the time I knew where he was and what the situation was, the year was over and he was at Hogwarts." "But you knew he was with Muggles." "I knew he was with Petunia." Sirius's voice was careful. "I didn't know about the cupboard. I didn't know about the clothing, the food, the way it was. I knew Petunia was." He stopped. "I didn't know." Hermione. "If you had known, in 1993, when you were free, what would you have done?" A silence. "I would have taken him," Sirius said. "The moment I got out, I would have gone to Privet Drive and taken him, fugitive or not." He looked at her. His voice had the quality of someone stating something that has been true for a long time and has not had an outlet. Yes, I would have taken him. But Dumbledore didn't tell you." "No." He looked at the fireplace. "He never told me it was like that." A pause. "So what do you think he told himself it was?" she said. Sirius had no answer for that. She hadn't expected one. She left him in the dark room with the stuffed elf heads and went upstairs to the room she'd been given, which was dusty and had curtains that hadn't been opened in probably 30 years. And she sat on the edge of the bed and opened the notebook. She wrote for a long time. She wrote. The isolation was not an accident. She wrote. The isolation, including the summers, was designed. Mrs. Figg, watching from Wisteria Walk. Letters controlled this summer to the point of being unrecognizable as his. No extended contact with the wizarding world across 14 years of childhood. She stopped. She thought about what she had said to McGonagall in year 1. A child does not arrive at a school feast and eat with that quality of attention unless something has taught him that. And she thought about the blood protection and the strategic rationale and the specific form of boy that 12 years of that house had produced. Grateful for small things, quick to say it was fine, not given to asking for help, not accustomed to the idea that his welfare was someone else's responsibility. She wrote, "It kept him grateful for anything. It kept him manageable." She stopped again. She made herself write the rest. Dumbledore needed a boy who would walk into death when the time came. He built one. He built Harry's world to produce that boy. She closed the notebook. She put it in her bag. She sat in the dusty room for a while, not quite in a state to think about anything else, and then she went to sleep. The ministry hearing happened in August, a formal session of the Wizengamot for the purposes of adjudicating Harry's use of underage magic in the presence of a Muggle. Dumbledore appeared at the last possible moment and defended Harry with the precise, complete competence of a man who has won cases before and did not need to raise his voice. Harry was acquitted. Dumbledore did not look at Harry during the proceedings, or speak to him directly, or acknowledge him afterward. Hermione was at Grimmauld Place. She tracked every detail that came back to her through Harry's account and Ron's account, and a carefully observed report from Arthur, who had been there. She noted the acquittal in the notebook. She noted Dumbledore's deliberate distance. She noted it because it was the same distance that had been there all along, the distance between the man who had arranged Harry's life and the boy whose life he had arranged. The term started in September. The year had not yet shown them what it would be, but it had already shown Hermione enough. The new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor arrived in September with the specific quality of authority that comes from institutional backing rather than competence. The kind that makes itself known through decorative rules and the particular pleasure taken in enforcing them. Hermione clocked her in the first lesson and adjusted her expectations accordingly. The woman had been sent by the Ministry. The Ministry did not believe there was a Dark Lord. The Ministry's view of defense against the dark arts was, this year, primarily academic. Hermione thought, we are going to need to teach ourselves. The organization she and Harry and Ron built over the autumn was, in the strictest sense, an illegal resistance cell meeting in a pub basement and then later a room that appeared when you needed it. She preferred to think of it as a study group with a specific institutional critique built in. She encoded the communication system in galleons, a protean charm, which was NEWT-level work, and she was 15, which she was aware was the kind of thing you filed away in a drawer labeled satisfying. And she watched, over the weeks that followed, as 30 students learned to produce patronuses and shield charms and reductor curses in the space where their official curriculum should have been. She was building an organization of students to resist institutional failure. She was also, and she was aware of this parallel, and had decided not to draw it out loud to anyone, doing what she had been doing since year one, responding to an authority's decision to look away from harm by doing the work the authority should have done. It was the same principle at a different scale. Then, she found out about the detentions. She noticed it in October, the way she noticed most things, not immediately, but accumulating detail until the detail formed a shape. Harry coming back from detention with a slightly wrong quality about his right hand, a specific way of not mentioning his hand. She had spent 5 years learning to read the shape of what Harry was not saying, so she asked, directly, what was happening in those detentions. He showed her his hand. She looked at the words carved into the skin. I must not tell lies, pink raised and clearly repeated, and she said nothing for a moment. She thought about what it took to have that kind of mark on your hand. She thought about the woman delivering the detentions, who had the Ministry's authority and the headmaster's absence of resistance, and the mark on Harry's hand was the result of those two things combined. She told Ron. Ron said, that's not the same thing. He meant, it's not what happened at the Dursleys, it's not the cupboard, it's not the same. Hermione said, no, but it's the same principle. Someone with authority harming Harry, and the people who are supposed to protect him looking away. She kept her voice even. She's been doing this for weeks. The headmaster knows, or he should know. No one has stopped it. Ron was quiet. He had the expression of someone working something out that had been available to be worked out for some time. He said, yeah. A pause. All right. Yeah. She added the detentions to the notebook. She was angry in a way she had learned to organize. Not cold, exactly, but filed. Put in the correct drawer and left there so it didn't interfere with the things that needed doing. The things that needed doing were, keep teaching people to cast shield charms, keep the galleons working, keep Harry showing up to the room on the 7th floor, keep everyone alive until the year ended. Ron spoke to Harry in November. She knew about it because Harry came to breakfast the following morning looking like a man who had slept badly because something had shifted in the night. And when she looked at Ron across the table, Ron gave her a short, specific nod that meant, I told him. She asked Harry about it later, just the two of them, in the corridor outside the Charms classroom. He said, Ron told me Hermione was right about it. What specifically? The framing. He said this carefully, like someone examining an object they have picked up and are not sure is safe to hold. That it had a name. That what happened there was a thing that happened to people, not just to me. Not just, it was a named thing, and I was telling myself it wasn't. He stopped. I know that. I've known it for a while. I just keep. A pause. It's hard to stop saying it was fine when you spent 10 years telling yourself it was fine. It's in how you think. She said, I know. He said, I know you know. The year ended in June in the Department of Mysteries, in the circular room with the spinning doors, in the dark, with 6 of them and 12 Death Eaters, and a stone archway that had a veil hanging in it, and a sound like whispering behind the veil that some of them could hear and some of them couldn't. She was unconscious for part of it, which meant she was not present to see Sirius fall through the veil. She was told about it afterward. Harry's account, which had the quality of something he was telling straight through once and would not return to. Sirius had been fighting Bellatrix Lestrange, who was 36 years old to Sirius's also 36 years old, and had not spent 12 of them in Azkaban. And Bellatrix had hit him with a curse, and he had fallen backward through the archway, and the veil had closed, and that was the end. There had been no body to take home. The archway had simply had Sirius Black in front of it, and then it didn't. She knew grief did not follow a schedule. She also knew Harry's grief for Sirius was not only grief, it was grief layered over every other loss. The parents who had died before he could remember them, the 12 years of a godfather in Azkaban, the 2 years of Sirius as a fugitive who could never quite be reached. Sirius had represented the answer to every question Hermione had been asking on Harry's behalf since year 3. Here was the person who should have had him. The answer was now through a veil. Dumbledore explained everything to Harry in his office after the Ministry debacle. Harry told Hermione afterward. He told her the blood protection charm, which she already knew. He told her the prophecy, which she had not known exactly, though she had suspected there was something organized underneath the luck. He told her what Dumbledore had said about why Harry had to stay at Privet Drive, why the arrangement had to be maintained, why the blood protection was more important than the rest. She listened to all of it. When he finished, she said, "He knew. Not just the blood protection. He knew what they were like. Mrs. Figg was reporting to him. He arranged your summers for a specific outcome." She paused. "He decided your pain was the price. And then he set a very old woman to watch from Wisteria Walk to make sure you didn't die of it." Harry looked at her with the expression she had first seen when he was 15, and Ron had said Hermione was right about the framing. It was the expression of someone holding something that was both true and very heavy. "He had reasons," Harry said. "He did," Hermione said. "Real ones. I'm not saying the blood protection wasn't real, or that it didn't work." She was choosing her words with care. "I'm saying he had real reasons, and what happened to you still happened. Both things are true. He knew both things were true. He chose one." Harry said nothing. "You're 15 years old," she said quietly. "You have 2 more Privet Drive summers unless something changes. I intend for something to change." He looked out the window of whatever room they were in. She couldn't remember afterward which one, only the light, slanted and late. He said, "You've been saying that since year 1. I know. I used to think it was just you. Just something you needed to do." He stopped. "It wasn't, was it?" "It was. I mean, you were right, but you were right because you were seeing something, not just arguing." "I was seeing something," she said. "Yeah." He turned from the window. I know you were." She wrote in the notebook that night. First explicit acknowledgement, Year 5, June 1996. "He knows I was seeing something. It took 5 years. It was not nothing." She underlined the last line. She wasn't sure why. Dumbledore arrived at 4 Privet Drive on a summer evening in 1996 and sat down in the Dursleys' sitting room and delivered, in measured and precise language, a formal accounting of how they had failed. Harry stood in the doorway and watched. He had waited 15 years for something like this. He had not known he was waiting exactly, he had told himself, and then been told by Hermione and slowly come to believe that what had happened to him had a name and a wrongness. But he had not expected it to be named out loud in the sitting room by the most powerful wizard alive, in a tone that had the quality of someone reading a verdict. Dumbledore said, "You took in this boy as your own, and you did not treat him as such." He said, "You have had him 10 years and done poorly by him." It landed with the specific weight of something a long time overdue. Vernon went purple. Petunia went white. Neither of them said anything. Harry stood in the doorway and thought, Hermione said this in year 1. She was 11 years old, and she said it in a train compartment, not even knowing what she was naming yet, with no authority behind her except the fact that she was right. She said it quietly and directly, and she did not have a century of magical expertise or the specific gravitas of the most respected wizard in Britain. She was just right, and she said it, and she had kept saying it for 5 years while the people with the actual power to say it had been waiting for a pedagogically useful moment. He did not say this out loud, but he thought it, standing in the doorway, and the thought had a complicated shape, gratitude and something that was not quite anger, and underneath both, the specific relief of being believed by someone the room would have to listen to. Dumbledore mentioned, before they left, that Sirius had left Harry a significant inheritance. 12 Grimmauld Place, a house elf, a vault. Petunia's face did something complicated at the name Sirius. Harry watched it and filed it away. They left through the front door. Harry put his trunk in the back of whatever magical transportation Dumbledore had arranged. He didn't ask, and they set off. And after a few minutes, Harry said, "What happened to your hand?" Dumbledore's right hand was black. Not bruised or burned. Black in the way something was black when it had been touched by something wrong at a fundamental level. It was shriveled and dead, and it looked like it had been that way for some time. Dumbledore told him the truth. A ring, a Horcrux, a curse that had been set to spread. He had stopped the spread. He had not been able to undo it. He had approximately a year. Harry sat with this for most of the journey. He sat with the architecture of it, the man who had arranged his childhood, who had had eyes on Wisteria Walk and had made the decision to maintain the blood protection across 15 years of Harry's life. This man had approximately a year. The strategic logic that had justified the cupboard and the bars and the controlled summers was about to lose its architect. The arrangement had not changed. The blood protection was still operating, but the person who had decided it was worth the cost was dying, and whatever came after would come without him. He wasn't sure what he felt about that. He wrote to Hermione about it that night. Christmas at the Burrow was the way it always was, warm and loud and structurally resistant to anything being too wrong for too long. Snow on the garden. Percy notably absent, which nobody mentioned in a way that made everyone think about it. Fred and George had a new line of products that involved things turning briefly into other things, which Molly did not encourage, and which Arthur found fascinating. Harry told Ron and Hermione about the Horcruxes on Christmas Eve, in the attic room he shared with Ron, with the door shut and the gnomes presumably asleep in the garden. Dumbledore had given permission. He told them everything. What they were, what Voldemort had done, how many there were, and how many had been destroyed. He told them he would be going to find the rest when the year ended, and he was not going back to Hogwarts to do it. Hermione's response was immediate and strategic, and involved her already mentally reorganizing her revision schedule to account for information she would need to learn and spells she would need to practice, and she had clearly been waiting, on some level, to be told what the actual shape of this was. Ron's response was to be quiet for a while and then say, "Right," with the particular weight of someone who has decided. They were both, without discussion, going with him. There was no negotiation. Ron fell asleep eventually, because Ron was good at sleeping in crisis conditions, which was one of his underrated gifts. Harry was still awake, sitting at the foot of the bed, and Hermione was still awake, sitting on the windowsill looking at the snow. She said, without turning, "When this is over, when you don't need the blood protection anymore, you're not going back there." A pause. "I want you to know that I will be there when you leave that house. Whatever that looks like, whenever the last time is, I will be there." Harry looked at her. "You've been saying things like that for 5 years." "I know. I didn't hear you, the first few times." Hermione. "I know that too." The snow was falling outside. Ron's breathing was even and unhurried. Harry thought about the Horcruxes and the blackened hand and the approximately a year and the blood protection that ran until he was 17 and the fact that Hermione had been building a case file since she was 11 years old, waiting for a moment when it might be possible to use it. "After all this," he said, "is there going to be a moment where someone has to answer for it?" Dumbledore, what he decided. She turned from the window. "I don't know, he'll be dead." She said it without flinching. She had had longer to sit with it. "The people who could answer for it are him and the Dursleys. The Dursleys will go on being the Dursleys. Dumbledore will have been what he was." She paused. "I have a record. I've been keeping a record for 5 years. I don't know what I'll do with it, but it's specific and it's dated, and it names things exactly." He looked at her. "You're going to write it down." "I've been writing it down." A small pause that had something rueful in it. "You thought it was a homework diary." "I thought it was a homework diary," Harry agreed. The year continued in the way year 6 years continued, lessons and Quidditch, and the low, constant dread of knowing something was coming. Hermione had 2 projects now, the Horcrux research and the notebook, and she moved between them with the efficiency of someone who has learned to think about more than one hard problem at a time. She added to the notebook through the autumn and spring, Dumbledore's visit to the Dursleys in June, documented with direct quotation as best she could reconstruct it. The blackened hand and the approximate timeline, the decision to maintain the arrangement across 15 years even as its architect was dying. She wrote, The blood protection expires 31st July 1997. She circled the date. She wrote, "What was built to last a childhood has an end date." What was built on top of the blood protection, the designed isolation, the managed dependence, the specific boy Dumbledore needed Harry to be, has an end date. She did not know what came after the end date. She knew she was going to be there for it. In June, Death Eaters entered Hogwarts through a passage Draco Malfoy had spent the year repairing. Harry was on the astronomy tower. He was 16 years old, paralyzed by a full body bind Dumbledore had cast from somewhere above him, and he watched from behind a suit of armor as Draco Malfoy, 17, pale, trembling in a way he was trying not to show, pointed his wand at the man who had built the magical world's most elaborate architecture of protection and protection's necessary costs. Draco could not do it. He had the authority and the mission and the wand at the ready, and he could not do it. Snape could. Snape did. Dumbledore went over the battlements with a specific finality. The green light was there, and then it wasn't, and the night was just night again, and the tower was empty except for Harry, still paralyzed, still watching. He lay on the tower for a long time after, released, not moving. He was thinking about a train, a September morning, a girl in the doorway of a compartment asking whose clothes those were. He was thinking about 5 years of someone building a case that no one in authority had wanted to hear. He was thinking about the man who had just died, who had both made the worst decision of Harry's childhood and been the best wizard Harry had ever known, and that both things could be true of the same person, and he still didn't know what to do with that. He went down the tower. The castle was still burning in places. The summer was almost here. The night Dumbledore died, Hermione cried. She was not sure when it started. There was a period of doing things, moving through the castle, accounting for Ron and Harry, checking that Neville was all right, watching Madame Pomfrey move between the people who had been in the fighting, and during that period, she was not crying, she was functioning, which was what you did. But sometime around 2 a.m. in Gryffindor Tower, sitting on the floor with her back against the common room wall and Ron asleep in the chair across from her and Harry staring at the fireplace, she found she was crying and had been for several minutes. Her grief had a shape that she could feel even in the middle of it. The shape was specific. She was grieving a man who had been brilliant, genuinely and formidably brilliant, in a way that she recognized and respected and had been in genuine awe of since the age of 11. She was grieving the person who had walked into the Dursleys' sitting room in June and said what needed to be said. She was grieving the teacher and the strategist and the mind that had held the magical world's safety in it for 50 years. She was also grieving while knowing that this man had looked at the evidence she had placed in front of him. Bars on a window, a child sleeping in a cupboard, 10 years of inadequate feeding and no birthday presents and a house where he was an inconvenience, and had looked at all of it and said, the blood protection is more important. She was grieving him and she was still angry at him, and both of those things were true at the same time, and she did not know how to feel them both without one of them becoming dishonest. She cried for a while. Harry didn't say anything, which was exactly right. Ron, asleep, didn't say anything, which was also exactly right, in a different way. In the early morning, she went up to the dormitory. She sat on her bed with the notebook in her lap and read through it. 6 years of entries. The handwriting changed across the years, she noticed. In year 1, it was the precise, slightly self-conscious handwriting of someone who had not yet learned that she wrote well and was still performing writing carefully. By year 6, it was faster, more compressed, the handwriting of someone who had too much to record and not enough time. She read, October 1991. McGonagall said she already objected in November 1981 and was overruled. The channel to Dumbledore is controlled by Dumbledore. She read, Year 2, Autumn 1992. Bars on the window are current year evidence. D did not act. He gave me the blood protection explanation. The explanation is true, and the bars are also true, and he chose the explanation. Both things are true, and he chose one. She read, Year 5, August 1995. Mrs. Fig. Someone watching from Wisteria Walk. Dumbledore had eyes there and still did nothing. The isolation was designed. The letters were controlled. He needed a specific kind of boy, and he built him. She closed the notebook. She did not tear out any pages. She did not decide it had been wrong to write them. She put it in her bag, the same pocket she had always used, and she sat for a while in the early morning with the window showing her a sky that was still deciding whether to be dark or light. The funeral was held beside the Black Lake. The white tomb was already there. It had appeared in the night, apparently, the way magical things appeared when they needed to. And the entire wizarding world was present, or enough of it that the grounds of Hogwarts held more people than Hermione had ever seen in one place. She stood next to Harry. He was in his black robes and almost 17, and he stood at the edge of the crowd in the particular way he stood in large groups, slightly separate, slightly watchful, slightly as though he had not entirely decided whether he was a participant or an observer. Ginny Weasley stood a few places away, 15 years old and not looking at Harry, which was its own kind of looking at Harry. McGonagall presided, 61 years old, deputy headmistress, now become de facto headmistress, straight-backed and Scottish and giving nothing away, and said the things that needed to be said about the man in the white tomb, which were true things and did not cover everything. Hermione stood and listened and thought. He was brilliant. He was wrong. He was brilliant and he was wrong, and he is now in a white tomb beside a lake, and neither of those truths closes the other. After the funeral by the lake, Harry told them. He said it plainly, in the way Harry had learned to say hard things. No preamble, no managing the landing, just the thing itself. He was going to hunt Horcruxes. He was not going back to Hogwarts. He was breaking it off with Ginny because he would not have her become a target for his choices. He said this last part in a voice that had made peace with the decision without being happy about it. Hermione said, "I'm coming." Ron said, "Obviously." There was no negotiation. She had known since year 3 that it was going to come to this. She had known since the moment in Lupin's office when she understood that there was something underneath all the yearly emergencies, some organizing logic, and that the logic pointed forward toward a confrontation. She had spent 4 years reading everything she could find, and she had the notebook, and she had the Horcrux research she had assembled since December. She said, "I've been preparing for this since year 3. The notebook has everything. The Horcrux research is organized by year and cross-referenced." Harry said, "Hermione." She said, "I know." They went back up to the castle. That evening, Harry found her by the lake again. The white tomb was there in the failing light, very still, very final. He stood beside her for a while without speaking. She waited. She had learned, across 6 years, when Harry was building toward something and needed to be given space to reach it. He said, "What does it feel like to be right?" She thought about it. She gave it the proper time, not because she didn't know the answer, but because the answer was complicated and deserved the time. Then she said, "I didn't want to be right. I wanted him to fix it. I kept going to him because I thought, if I found the right words, the right evidence, the right framing, he would see it and act on it. He always saw everything. I watched him understand things before anyone else in a room understood that there was something to understand. I thought he'd see this too, and that when he saw it, he would do the obvious thing, which was stop it." A pause. "He did see it," Harry said. "I know." She looked at the white tomb. "That's the part I keep trying to think my way around. He saw it, and he had real reasons, and his real reasons were real. The blood protection worked. The charm held. Voldemort couldn't touch you at Privet Drive. The reasons were not invented, and he was still wrong. He made a choice that he knew caused harm because he judged the harm acceptable, and the harm was you. The harm was your childhood." She stopped. "Both things are true. Both things have been true since 1981. He was brilliant, and he was wrong, and both of those are just true, and I don't know what to do with someone who is both." Harry was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about it since the tower," he said. "What you'd say. What did you think I'd say?" "Something like that." He looked at the lake. "I thought you'd be angrier." "I am angry," she said. "I've been angry for 6 years. Anger doesn't mean you can't also—" She paused. He was extraordinary. That's not what makes it all right, but it's also just true. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had run out of easy things to say and had arrived somewhere more honest. Harry said, "I have to go back one more time." "I know." The blood protection expired on his 17th birthday. She had the date circled in the notebook, July 31st, 1997, 6 weeks away. One more summer. Then it's done. The arrangement, Privet Drive, all of it, it's done. "Yes," he said. "Will you write?" She looked at him. "Every day. Not the managed letters. Not what we were sending in year 5. Actual letters. What I'm actually thinking about and what I'm actually doing and what the research has found and what Ron said that was annoying. She paused. Everything. Harry said. They'll intercept them. Then they'll read some excellent letters. She turned from the lake. Come on. We have things to do before we can leave. He followed her up the slope toward the castle. The sky was doing something complicated with the last of the light. The white tomb was behind them, still and complete beside the water, and the man inside it had made a decision that had shaped the first 15 years of Harry's life, and neither of them was finished thinking about it, and they probably never would be, and they went up toward the castle together to start getting ready for what came next. The Dursleys packed as though they were leaving for a fortnight in Majorca and had decided to bring the entire house. Vernon moved through the rooms with the efficiency of a man who had organized things before and found efficiency comforting, which was accurate. He packed in a specific order, important documents first, then valuables, then clothing in the correct seasonal rotation, and he did not look at Harry. He had not looked directly at Harry since June, which was the longest unbroken run in Harry's recent memory, and Harry was choosing to take this as an improvement. Petunia was the one who gave him trouble. She moved through the house slowly, touching things as she passed them. The kitchen worktop, the banister, the windowsill of the front sitting room. She was not packing. She was doing something that Harry could not quite name and found difficult to watch. She had lived in this house for as long as Harry had been alive. She had, in her precise and ungenerous way, run it. The curtains always right, the garden always trimmed, the net in the window always white. It had been her project and her evidence and her demonstration that she was not who she had come from. She was leaving it behind on the instructions of people she couldn't see, for reasons she didn't fully understand, and she was saying goodbye to a house the way you said goodbye to things when you had no one obvious to say goodbye to. Harry watched her touch the banister and did not say anything. He did not have anything to say. The two of them had achieved, across 16 years, a kind of truce that was not warmth, but was not the active hostility of the Vernon end of things, just a wary, exhausted distance. He had never thanked her. She had never apologized. They would probably die with those things unsaid. 2 Order members arrived to escort the Dursleys. They were efficient, they were polite, and they were firm, and in 20 minutes they had Vernon and Petunia and everything Vernon and Petunia had packed moving toward a car that would take them to a location that the Death Eaters did not have. Dudley was last. He stopped in the hallway. He was 17 years old and beefy in the way he had always been beefy, but something had shifted in the arrangement of him in the past 2 years. Something in his face that was less the face of someone who had never needed to think about other people and more the face of someone who had begun to try. He looked at Harry. "All right, then," he said. "All right," Harry said. Dudley put out his hand. Harry looked at it for a moment and then shook it. Dudley's hand was large and warm, and that was all there was to say about it. Hermione was in the doorway of the sitting room, watching. She had never seen these 2 people together before. She had been hearing about Dudley for 7 years, the second bedroom, the 37 birthday presents, the Smeltings uniform, the way the Dursleys' house had arranged itself around Dudley's comfort with Harry somewhere in the margins of it. The person in front of her was 17 and awkward and was shaking Harry's hand with the expression of someone who knew they owed an apology they did not have the words for yet and was making the handshake do the work instead. She thought, that will have to be enough. And it was. And it wasn't. And Dudley left. The Order members went with them. There was a brief conversation outside about timing and the plan for the evening and what would happen next, and then the door closed and the house was empty except for Harry and Hermione and the sound of a neighborhood going about its quiet summer business outside. Harry stood in the hallway. He looked at the door under the stairs. He moved toward it, and Hermione moved with him without deciding to, not thinking about whether to follow, just following, the way she had been following or leading or walking beside for 7 years. He stopped in front of the cupboard. He put his hand on the knob. He opened it. It was a cupboard. That was all it was now. Brooms stacked against one wall, old coats on hooks, a smell of dust and something stale underneath that was probably decades of accumulated cupboard rather than anything specific. The bed that had been in it was long gone. The spiders that had apparently been a childhood fixture, he had mentioned them exactly once, casually, and she had written it down, were not visible. There was a strip of old carpet that might once have been a rug. There was the dark. Harry stood looking into it. She did not say anything. She stood beside him and did not say, "I told you," or "I'm sorry," or "I can't imagine," and she did not fill the silence, because the silence was his. He said, "I used to keep my birthday presents in here." She waited. "From before I had any," he said. "There weren't any yet. But I used to think, when they came, when people started giving me presents, this is where I'd put them." A pause. "I had a spot picked out, the corner there. I'd work out what I was going to get, and I'd picture putting it in the corner." She said, "How old were you?" "I don't know. 7, maybe. 6. He looked at the corner. "I didn't know that you needed someone to give you things. I thought presents just arrived, like the post. Harry, it wasn't—" He stopped. "I wasn't unhappy all the time. I want you to know that. Some of it was just quiet. It was just, this was the space, and I was in it, and I read a lot, and I thought a lot. Some of it was just what it was." "I know," she said. "That's not the part that was wrong." He looked at her. "The part that was wrong," she said, "was that someone knew. Someone sent letters addressed to this address. The cupboard under the stairs, 4 Privet Drive. Someone wrote those words down and sent them here, which means someone knew exactly what this was. Someone watched from Wisteria Walk. And it was allowed. You were here, and it was allowed, and someone had decided it was worth allowing." She paused. "That's the part that was wrong," Harry said. "He had his reasons." "Yes," Hermione said. Another pause. Longer. "I've spent 7 years trying to make those reasons not matter," she said. "I'm not sure I succeeded. The reasons keep being real. The blood protection worked. Voldemort couldn't touch you at Privet Drive for 16 years. I can't make that not true just because I want it not to matter." She was very quiet. "I didn't fix it. I want you to know I didn't fix it. None of the routes worked. McGonagall, Dumbledore, the Weasleys, Sirius, none of it produced the outcome I was looking for, which was someone removing you from this house and putting you somewhere that wanted you." Harry was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You did something else." She looked at him. "You made me know that it mattered," he said, "to someone, while it was happening." He looked back at the cupboard. "I knew someone saw it. Not Dumbledore seeing it and calculating it. You seeing it and minding about it specifically. I knew there was a person who thought this was wrong and wasn't going to stop thinking so." He stopped. "That's not nothing." She looked at him for a long time. He was 17 years old and standing in front of a cupboard in a house that was about to stop being his, and he was telling her that what she had done had been enough. She did not entirely believe him. She did not think he was wrong. She said, "We should go." He closed the cupboard door. They went outside. What followed was not quiet. What followed was broomsticks and thestrals and 7 people who looked like Harry Potter, polyjuiced and scattered across the sky on a night that had been planned by people who were very good at plans and interrupted by someone who had known the plan. Spells in the dark. Hedwig in her cage on the back of the broom, killed by a curse that wasn't meant for her, or was meant for whatever was most beloved, which amounted to the same thing. Chaos over the fields of Surrey, and then chaos over the motorway, and then chaos somewhere over a part of England she couldn't see, and then the burrow, and the gate, and Molly Weasley coming out of the house in her dressing gown. One of the Order members who had gone into the sky that night did not come back. Harry arrived at the burrow with blood on his sleeve and the look of someone who had just come through something and had not yet taken inventory of the cost. He stood in the garden and looked at the house, which was still lit and still warm and still the burrow, and Hermione was already at the gate. He was free of Privet Drive. He would not go back. The locket was the worst of it. Not the cold, which was persistent and made every morning feel like a recrimination. Not the hunger, which was manageable most of the time. Not the rootlessness, the moving from forest to field to hillside, never settled, always ready to move. Those were difficult in the ordinary ways that difficult things were difficult. The locket was different. The locket was Salazar Slytherin's Horcrux, a fragment of the darkest soul in recent magical history encased in gold, and when you wore it, when it hung against your chest for an hour or a day because they rotated the wearing, because nobody should carry it all the time, it did something to the quality of your thoughts. It took the things that were already there, the fears and resentments, and the things you had not said, and the doubts you had managed to contain through effort, and it made them louder. It made them feel like the truth. It peeled away the narrative you had constructed around your fears and replaced it with something simpler and more final. Ron wore it longest in any given rotation. He was trying not to show that it was affecting him, the willingness to take the damage without naming it, to absorb it quietly and keep moving. He wore it, and it fed on his worst fears, which were not what he had expected. He had thought he feared failure, inadequacy. The locket found something underneath, that he wasn't needed, that Harry and Hermione were enough for each other, had always been enough, and his presence was incidental. He left on a November night when the tent was very cold and the locket had been on his chest for most of the day. He came back eventually. But he wasn't there yet. And until he came back, there were weeks in December when Harry and Hermione were alone in the tent. Hermione had a system for keeping each other alive. Meals at regular intervals, conversation in the evenings, a rotation of tasks that gave the days a shape. She had turned out to be very good at surviving, which was not a thing she had known about herself before the tent, because she had not previously been called upon to discover it. One night in December, Harry asked her why she hadn't stopped. He asked it without preamble, sitting across the small camp table from her in the blue light of the tent, his cup of tea going cold in his hands. He said, "After Dumbledore shut you down in year 2. After the statute of secrecy blocked the Muggle route. After Sirius couldn't be a guardian and the ministry hearing went through without you and none of it worked. You spent 7 years and nothing you tried produced the outcome you were looking for." A pause. "Why didn't you stop?" She thought about it. She gave it the real time. She said, "I grew up in a house where my parents knew what rights children had. That was just information I had, what the law said a child was owed, what abuse meant in a legal and practical sense. I walked into the magical world when I was 11, and the magical world had collectively decided, not officially, not in writing, but effectively, to look away from what it was doing to the most famous child it had, the child it had been building stories around for 10 years. She stopped. I knew what I was looking at. I knew what the word for it was. I had the information and I couldn't unknow it. Once I had seen it, I couldn't make myself look away just because looking away would have been easier. I am not built for looking away from things I have seen." Harry was quiet for a while. Outside, something moved in the trees, something small and nocturnal and having a better night than they were. He said, "I'm glad you're built that way." She said, "I know." Ron came back in January, having destroyed the locket with the sword of Gryffindor, which Harry had retrieved from a frozen pool after a silver doe Patronus led him there in the night. The locket's destruction had been the kind of thing that was difficult to watch, even secondhand. The locket had shown Ron his fears made real, had said, "You are not needed," and Ron had held the sword and destroyed it anyway, which was what Ron always did, eventually. He was built for the eventually. The trio was intact. They moved on. They had gone to Godric's Hollow in December, before Ron came back, when it was just Harry and Hermione in the snow. The graveyard was quiet in the way such graveyards were quiet on winter nights. They found the Potter's grave, James, March 27, 1960, October 31, 1981. Lily, January 30, 1960, October 31, 1981. The snow was on the grave markers and on Hermione's shoulders, where she had stopped moving and was just standing. Harry wept, not quietly, not in the managed way he had been doing difficult things recently. He wept the way you wept when the defenses came down, which they did sometimes, in the cold, at a gravestone, on a night when there was no one watching except someone who had been watching for 7 years and could be trusted with the unmanaged version. Hermione conjured flowers and put them on the grave and stood beside him and did not say anything because there was nothing to say, and she had learned a long time ago when not to fill silence. The war memorial was at the edge of the village, a stone obelisk to anyone who passed without knowing, but something else entirely if you were a witch or wizard. A statue of a man and a woman and an infant, the 3 of them together in the way they had only managed to be together for a year before Voldemort found them. Harry stood in front of it for a long time on the way out of the village. She stood beside him. Spring brought Malfoy Manor. She would not, afterward, be able to account for the time in the drawing room with any precision. There was a period in the middle where the details stopped being organized information and became something else. Something without sequence or edge. Bellatrix Lestrange was in the drawing room. That was the fact at the center of the other facts. What Hermione was certain of, Harry was on the other side of a locked door. She had heard him in the cellar below, heard him and Ron together, and she had known that whatever was happening to her was not happening to them, which had been the only thing she could hold on to in the moments that mattered. Harry heard her. She did not know this until later. He told her, weeks afterward at Shell Cottage, sitting on the grass above the sea, that he had heard and that something had shifted permanently. He said, "You went through all of that because of who I am. 7 years of all of it, and then Malfoy Manor, and it's because of who I am and what was done to me, and I can't—" He stopped. "I owe you something I can't pay back." She said, "You cannot let it be for nothing." He looked at her. "That's the plan." Before Shell Cottage there had been Dobby. Dobby had come to the manor when Harry called for him, had come in the final hour when there was no other way, and he had died for it on the beach outside with a knife that had been meant for Harry. Harry dug the grave by hand. She watched him do it in the dark, refusing the magic, and understood this as something he was choosing, to mark it correctly, to do it the hard way because the hard way was the honest way, to be a person who acted from choice rather than from reflex. The stone Harry placed at the head of the grave said, "Here lies Dobby, a free elf." Afterward, in the small hours, she brought him a cup of tea. She sat beside him on the grass above the grave. The sea was dark and the stars were out, and neither of them said anything for a long time. This was what it was, sometimes. Not a conversation, not a plan, just she was there, and he knew she was there, and it was dark, and they were alive, and they sat together and drank their tea. In the morning, there would be Gringotts, and then Hogwarts, and then everything that came after everything. But that was the morning. The shrieking shack smelled of old wood and something older, and Snape died in it on the floor with Nagini's poison in his blood, pressing his memories into Harry's hands in the last minutes he had. Harry took them to the Pensieve. What he saw there, a boy with black hair and a hooked nose who had loved a girl with red hair since they were children in Cokeworth, and had gone on loving her through school and through the war and through her choosing someone else, and had spent the years after her death constructing an elaborate architecture of apparent cruelty. The contempt, the precise targeting of every vulnerability Harry visibly had as cover for watching over Lily Evans's son. Snape's Patronus was a doe, the same as Lily's. It had always been the same as Lily's. Harry stood in the stone basin's memory and understood something he had not had the frame for before. Dumbledore's architecture and Snape's architecture had been the same building, both constructed over 17 years around Harry, both built for Lily. The woman who had died for her son had become the organizing principle of 2 men's lives. She had not been consulted. Harry left the Pensieve. He went to the Forbidden Forest. He had had time, in the walk through the castle and across the grounds, to think about what he was doing. He was 17 years old, carrying a snitch with the Resurrection Stone, walking toward Voldemort to die because Voldemort had accidentally made him a Horcrux that had to be destroyed. He understood this the way he understood other enormous things, by holding it at a slight angle and keeping walking. He opened the snitch. His parents came to him there, and Sirius, and Lupin. He kept walking. What came after the forest was not death. What came after was the thing that came after death when death was not, in fact, the end. A white place, quiet, and then coming back, and then the Great Hall, and then the part where Neville Longbottom pulled the sword of Gryffindor out of the Sorting Hat. Neville, born the day before Harry, the boy the prophecy had brushed against before landing on Harry instead, forged across 7 years into someone who would reach into a burning hat and pull out a sword. He was 17, and he had made a choice. The choice had killed Nagini, and Nagini's death had meant Voldemort was mortal again, and mortals could be stopped. Harry stopped him. In the Great Hall, where the last confrontation happened, Harry cast Expelliarmus because Expelliarmus was what he did, what he had always done, and Voldemort cast Avada Kedavra because Avada Kedavra was what Voldemort had always done, and the Elder Wand refused to kill the person it had recognized as its master, and the killing curse went back, and Voldemort fell, and the war was over. He was 71 years old, born on the last day of a year, and then he was done. The casualties came in afterward, in fragments. Fred Weasley, 20 years old, killed in an explosion near the Great Hall. Percy had been with him and would carry that for the rest of his life. Remus Lupin killed in the fighting, and Tonks with him, who had married him the year before and left a son who would not remember either of them. Molly Weasley killed Bellatrix Lestrange herself, in the way that only a mother's fury could end something that durable. Harry stood in the Great Hall in the hours after the battle, and the Great Hall was a triage ward and a mourning room and a space where people who had made it through were trying to find the people they had made it through with. He looked at the tables. The 4 long tables where the sorting feast had been laid in September 1991, when he had been 11 years old and had eaten until he thought he might be sick, not knowing when there would be food again. He had spent 7 years learning that meals were guaranteed. A lesson accumulated, meal by meal, at the Weasleys' kitchen table and the tent in the forest where Hermione had cooked at regular intervals, even when neither of them wanted to eat. He had learned that abundance was reliable. That was one of the things Hermione had done. Ron found them. And then the 3 of them were together in the Great Hall in the wreckage and the morning light, 17 and 18 years old, and the war they had been born into was over. The days after the battle were full of things that needed to be done. Testimony, ministry officials, journalists at the gates, people who needed Harry's account of what had happened. He made some statements. He declined to make others. He went to the burrow and ate and slept. A week after the battle, Hermione came to him with the notebook. She put it on the table in front of him. It was the same composition notebook she had bought at a W.H. Smith near King's Cross the summer before year 1, now full E. She had added pages when the original ones ran out, organized by year with tabs made from old parchment. He had known about it for years. He had not, until now, read it. She said, "The magical world needs to know what it did to you, not to prosecute anyone. They're dead or scattered. Not to change what happened, but because it happened, and someone should have to know it happened, and it should exist on paper." He read it. He read all 6 years of it, Hermione's handwriting changing from the careful script of an 11-year-old to the compressed, efficient hand of someone who had too much to record. October 1991, McGonagall. Year 2, Dumbledore's office, the blood protection explanation, the Weasleys' kitchen, Sirius at Grimmauld Place saying I would have taken him. The ministry hearing, Dumbledore not looking at Harry. The pattern named isolation designed, letters controlled, a specific kind of boy required by a specific kind of war. He read until the entries stopped at July 1997. He said, "All right." He sat down with her at the table and they wrote the account together. It was not a complaint, not a prosecution, it was a document. It named the cupboard under the stairs at 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey, where Harry Potter had slept from his earliest memory until July 1991, 10 years. It named the letters addressed there, Mr. H. Potter, the cupboard under the stairs. It named Arabella Figg at Wisteria Walk, her instructions, the years of watching. It named every summer, in order. When it was done, Harry said, "Why did you keep going? When no one helped? When it didn't seem to change anything?" Hermione said, "It changed you. You stopped thinking it was normal. Is that enough?" She thought about it for a long time. She thought about McGonagall in the corridor with the door already shut. She thought about Sirius in the dark drawing room. I would have taken him. She thought about Harry in front of the cupboard, the corner where he had planned to put his birthday presents before he knew he'd need someone to give them to him. She said, "It's not nothing. It's the difference between growing up thinking you deserved a cupboard and growing up knowing someone thought you didn't." He looked at her. "I knew," he said. "That's the thing. I knew someone thought I didn't." She nodded. He put the document in the notebook. She put the notebook in her bag, and that was that. They went to Godric's Hollow 3 weeks later, in the early summer, Harry and Ron and Hermione. The village was quiet in the way it was always quiet. The war memorial stood at the center, a stone obelisk to anyone passing who didn't know, a statue of 3 people for anyone who did, a man and a woman holding a baby in a village where they had been alive for a year before they weren't. They walked to the graveyard. They found the graves. James, 27th March 1960, 31st October 1981. Lily, 30th January 1960, 31st October 1981. Harry stood at the graves and did not weep. He had wept before in the snow with Hermione beside him, and the weeping had been real, and he did not need to do it again. He stood and looked at the names. He was 17 years old, and the war was behind him, and the cupboard was behind him, and the summers of no letters were behind him, and the bars on the window were behind him. He was not the boy who lived in a cupboard. He was not the boy who lived. He was Harry, and Ron was beside him, and Hermione was beside him, and Hermione had seen him first, on a train, on a September morning, on the way to a life he had not yet known he was about to have. She had said, "That's not right.